In September of 1874, deep in the coal-scarred mountains of West Virginia, 3 armed men vanished without a trace near Elkhorn Creek. Their bodies would be discovered days later, buried in shallow graves along the muddy banks, each bearing fatal gunshot wounds from a weapon that should have been impossible for their killer to handle. The only witness to their deaths was a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Weaver, who walked out of those same mountains carrying a rifle nearly as tall as himself, his clothes torn and blood-stained, speaking in a voice far too calm for a child who had just lost everything. Local authorities buried the investigation as quickly as they buried the bodies, but the miners who found those corpses still whisper about the boy's cold, steady eyes, and the 3 words he spoke when questioned about the killings. They deserved worse. The case files from that autumn remain sealed in the basement of the Mercer County Courthouse, marked with a notation that simply reads, "Matter resolved by mutual agreement. Further investigation suspended by order of Sheriff W. Thornton." Before we continue with the story of Thomas Weaver and the dark secrets that died with him in those Appalachian hills, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because these mountains hold more secrets than you might imagine. What the authorities didn't want anyone to know was that those 3 dead men weren't random victims of mountain justice. They were enforcers for the Consolidated Coal Company, and Thomas Weaver had just declared war on the most powerful corporation in West Virginia. But the true horror of this story isn't what happened that September night by Elkhorn Creek. It's what happened in the months that followed, when a child's thirst for vengeance transformed an entire region's understanding of fear. The autumn of 1874 found the mountains of West Virginia transformed by an industry that devoured both coal and men with equal hunger. Small communities that had survived on hunting, farming, and timber for generations now trembled under the thunder of mining equipment and the constant rumble of coal trains snaking through valleys that had known only birdsong for centuries. The air itself had changed. Where once the crisp mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and wild flowers, now it rare of coal dust and sulfur, a metallic taste that coated the tongue and stained the lungs of everyone who breathed it. The Consolidated Coal Company had purchased vast tracts of land throughout the region, bringing with them not just jobs, but a particular brand of justice that operated outside the reach of local law. Company towns sprouted like poisonous mushrooms in clearings that had been carved from ancient forests, their hastily constructed buildings already showing signs of the subsidence that would eventually swallow entire neighborhoods as the mines beneath them expanded. In these isolated hollows where the nearest sheriff might be a day's ride away through treacherous mountain passes, the company's security men, locally known as coal police, served as judge, jury, and often executioner for any miner who dared question working conditions, wages, or the company's iron-fisted control over every aspect of daily life. These men wore no uniforms, carried no badges, yet wielded authority that extended far beyond the mine entrances. They decided who could shop at the company store, whose children could attend the company school, whose families would be evicted for failing to meet quotas or showing insufficient loyalty. The coal police were recruited from the dregs of post-Civil War society, former Confederate soldiers who had found no place in the new America, discharged Union veterans whose war experiences had left them comfortable with violence, drift, and criminals who discovered that corporate employment offered both protection from the law and unlimited opportunities for cruelty. They lived in a boarding house on the outskirts of Beckley, a ramshackle structure that the locals called Devil's Rest, where they spent their off hours drinking rot-gut whiskey and planning new methods of intimidation. Families like the Weavers, who had worked these mountains for 3 generations, found themselves caught between the promise of steady wages and the reality of indentured servitude. The company paid in scrip that could only be spent at company stores where prices were inflated, to ensure that workers remained perpetually in debt. Housing was provided in company-owned shacks that leaked in winter and baked in summer, with rent automatically deducted from wages that never seemed sufficient to cover basic necessities. Thomas Weaver lived with his father Samuel and older brother Jacob in a cabin overlooking Elkhorn Creek, where his grandfather, Ezekiel, had first settled after fighting in the War of 1812. The cabin was one of the few independent homesteads remaining in the area, built from handheld logs that had weathered 40 years of mountain storms. Inside the walls were lined with deer hides and bearskins that Ezekiel had taken during the early days when wildlife was abundant before the mining operations had driven most animals deeper into the mountains. Samuel Weaver was a man shaped by hard choices and harder circumstances. At 38, his hands were already gnarled from years of swinging a pickaxe, his lungs scarred from breathing coal dust, his back permanently bent from crawling through tunnels, barely tall enough for a child. He had fought for the Union during the Civil War, serving with the 1st West Virginia Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and the experience had taught him both the value of discipline and the terrible cost of violence. When he returned home in 1865, he had hoped to resume the quiet life of a mountain farmer, but the arrival of the coal company had made such dreams impossible. The morning shift at mine number 7 began before dawn, when the mountain air was so cold that breath formed crystalline clouds, and the ground crunched with frost beneath heavy boots. Samuel would wake Thomas and Jacob with a gentle shake, speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing neighbors who worked different shifts and needed their sleep. Breakfast was usually cornmeal mushed with molasses, occasionally supplemented with eggs from the family's 3 surviving chickens. The others had died from breathing coal dust that settled on everything within miles of the mining operations. Jacob, at 17, possessed all the restless energy and quick temper that Samuel had learned to suppress. Through years of dealing with company supervisors, the boy stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and large hands that marked him as his father's son. But his eyes held a defiant spark that worried Samuel deeply. Jacob had started working as a timber setter 6 months earlier, responsible for installing the wooden supports that prevented tunnel collapses. It was dangerous work that required both physical strength and careful attention to detail. A single poorly placed beam could result in cave-ins that buried entire work crews. The boy had already seen 3 men die in preventable accidents caused by the company's refusal to purchase adequate safety equipment. When Jacob complained to his supervisor about rotting timbers that should have been replaced weeks earlier, he was told that questioning company procedures was grounds for immediate termination. The conversation had ended with Jacob's supervisor, a weasel-faced man named Garrett Mills, making pointed comments about how easy it would be for someone to have an accident if they continued to cause trouble. Thomas was different from both his father and brother in ways that made even his own family uncomfortable. Small for his 12 years, he possessed an unsettling intelligence that manifested in his ability to read people's intentions and motivations with uncanny accuracy. Where other children played games and told stories, Thomas observed and calculated, noting patterns in adult behavior that allowed him to predict their actions with disturbing precision. His mother Mary had died giving birth to him in the brutal winter of 1862, when medical help was impossible to obtain and Samuel was away fighting in the war. Thomas had been raised primarily by his grandfather Ezekiel, a man whose own experiences fighting in the War of 1812 and surviving decades of frontier life had taught him that the world was a place where weakness invited destruction. Under Ezekiel's tutelage, Thomas had learned to hunt, track, and shoot with a proficiency that amazed even experienced woodsmen. The rifle Thomas carried was a .44 caliber Spencer repeating rifle, one of the most advanced weapons of its era. Ezekiel had acquired it from a dying Union soldier during the retreat from Richmond, and he had maintained it in perfect working condition throughout the intervening years. The weapon held 7 rounds in its tubular magazine, and could be fired as quickly as the operator could work the lever action, a rate of fire that gave a skilled marksman an enormous advantage over opponents armed with single-shot weapons. But Thomas's education had extended far beyond marksmanship. Ezekiel had taught him to move silently through dense forest, to read tracks and sign that revealed the passage of both animals and humans, to find water and shelter in the wilderness, and most importantly, to think like a predator when circumstances demanded it. The old man had lived through periods when survival depended on being more dangerous than the dangers that surrounded you, and he had passed those lessons to his grandson with a thoroughness that would have horrified more civilized observers. By September 1874, tensions between the miners and the Consolidated Coal Company had reached a breaking point that threatened to explode into open warfare. Wages had been cut twice that summer, while the company store raised prices on basic necessities like flour, bacon, and kerosene, trapping families in cycles of debt that grew worse with each passing month. Children were going to bed hungry, while company executives lived in mansions built with profits extracted from the blood and sweat of mountain families. Safety conditions in the mines had deteriorated so badly that cave-ins occurred almost weekly. Yet any miner who refused to work in obviously dangerous conditions was immediately blacklisted, and often run out of town by the coal police. The company's attitude was simple. Workers were replaceable. Coal was not. If men died extracting it, there were always more desperate families willing to take their places. The coal police had become increasingly bold in their intimidation tactics, no longer confining their activities to the mining camps, but extending their reach into the independent settlements where families like the Weavers still maintained some semblance of autonomy. Houses were searched without warrants, livestock disappeared overnight, and anyone who spoke out against company policies found themselves facing midnight visits from men who made their intentions clear without ever explicitly making threats. The trouble that would ultimately lead to 3 graves beside Elkhorn Creek began on September 15th, when Samuel Weaver made a decision that would define the remaining years of his life. That morning, as he descended into the suffocating darkness of mine number 7 for what he didn't know would be his final shift, Samuel carried with him a petition that represented months of careful organization and considerable personal risk. The document, written in Samuel's careful script on paper, purchased with money the family could barely afford to spend, detailed specific safety violations that had been ignored by company supervisors despite repeated complaints from workers. It described rotting timber supports that cracked ominously under the weight of unstable mountain stone, ventilation systems so inadequate that men regularly collapsed from breathing poisonous gases, and the company's practice of forcing miners to work with equipment so faulty that accidents were not just likely, but inevitable. Most damning of all, the petition included a detailed account of the company's policy of threatening workers who refused to enter obviously dangerous areas. It named specific supervisors who had told miners that questioning safety procedures would result in immediate termination and blacklisting, effectively forcing men to choose between their lives and their ability to feed their families. 47 miners had signed the petition, each man understanding that putting his name on the document might mean the end of his livelihood and possibly his life. These were not radical agitators or outside troublemakers, but ordinary mountain men who had simply reached the limit of what they could endure. They had watched friends die in preventable accidents, seen children grow thin and weak from malnutrition, witnessed elderly parents suffer from illnesses that could have been treated if company doctors weren't instructed to minimize treatment costs. Samuel's plan was to present the petition to mine foreman Augustus Blackwood during the shift change, when other workers would be present as witnesses and the supervisor would be less likely to resort to immediate violence. It was a reasonable strategy that demonstrated Samuel's understanding of company politics and his hope that rational discourse might still be possible. What Samuel didn't know was that one of the miners who had signed the petition was actually an informant for the company. a desperate man named Henry Caldwell, who had accumulated such massive debts at the company store that he would do anything to avoid eviction from company housing. Caldwell's youngest daughter was suffering from consumption, and he had been told that her continued access to the company doctor depended on his cooperation with management. Faced with choosing between loyalty to his fellow workers and his child's life, Caldwell had made the only choice a father could make. By the time Samuel descended the wooden ladder into the mine shaft that morning, Augustus Blackwood already knew about the petition and had sent word to the coal police that immediate action would be required. The foreman, a brutal man who had earned his position through a combination of political connections and willingness to use violence against workers, saw the petition not as a legitimate grievance, but as an act of rebellion that threatened the entire system of control that kept the mines profitable. The confrontation, when it came, was brief and decisive. Samuel presented the petition with quiet dignity, explaining that the men were not seeking to cause trouble, but simply wanted to work under conditions that didn't guarantee their deaths. Blackwood listened in silence, his pale eyes never leaving Samuel's face, then tore the document into pieces that he scattered across the mine floor like confetti. "I want every man who signed this paper to report to my office after the shift ends," Blackwood said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the other workers. "We need to discuss their continued employment with this company." Samuel understood immediately that reporting to Blackwood's office would be tantamount to signing his own death warrant. The foreman's discussions were troublesome. Workers were notorious for ending with accidents that left no witnesses and few questions. But he also knew that failing to appear would bring even worse consequences, not just for himself, but for his family. That evening, as the Weaver family sat down to their usual dinner of cornbread, beans, and the rabbit Thomas had brought home from his morning hunt, Samuel explained the situation to his sons with the careful precision of a man who understood that words might be all he had left to give them. He spoke of duty and honor, of the difference between courage and foolishness, and of the terrible choices that circumstances sometimes forced upon decent people. Jacob's reaction was immediate and predictable. He wanted to fight, to gather weapons and allies, and face the company's thugs with the kind of direct violence that young men always believed could solve complex problems. Thomas listened in silence, his dark eyes moving between his father and brother as he absorbed not just their words, but the emotional undercurrents that revealed more than either man realized about their true intentions. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, the deliberate pace of their hoofbeaters announcing visitors who were in no hurry, because they knew their quarry had nowhere to run. Samuel stood slowly, his hand automatically checking the position of the hunting knife he wore on his belt, then moved to the cabin's single window to peer through glass that was cloudy with age and coal dust. 3 men were dismounting from their horses with the casual confidence of predators who had cornered their prey. Samuel recognized them immediately. Marcus Finch, Dale Hutchinson, and James Crawford, the triumvirate of violence that enforced the coal company's will throughout the region. Their presence at his cabin meant that whatever happened next had been planned and approved at the highest levels of corporate management. Marcus Finch was the unofficial leader of the coal police, a former Confederate cavalry officer whose unit had gained notoriety during the war for their treatment of Union prisoners. Tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and eyes like chips of winter ice, Finch possessed the kind of cruel intelligence that made him effective at psychological intimidation. He dressed better than his companions, wearing a black suit that was always clean despite the rough nature of his work, and he carried a pair of matched Colt revolvers and holsters that showed the wear patterns of frequent use. Dale Hutchinson was Finch's opposite in almost every way. A massive man whose bulk was muscle rather than fat, whose scarred hands testified to a lifetime of solving problems through brute force. He had drifted into West Virginia after the war, carrying stories about service with Sherman's army that no one could verify, but no one dared question. Hutchinson was the kind of man who enjoyed his work, who took pleasure in the fear he inspired and the pain he inflicted. When subtle intimidation failed, he was the one who made examples that kept other potential troublemakers in line. James Crawford was the most dangerous of the three, precisely because he appeared to be the least threatening, of average height and build, with thinning brown hair and unremarkable features. Crawford looked like a shopkeeper or clerk rather than a killer, but those who knew him understood that his ordinary appearance concealed a complete absence of human empathy. Crawford killed without anger or passion, viewing violence as simply another tool to be employed when circumstances required it. He was the one sent to handle situations that required planning and precision rather than brute force. The conversation that followed would be the last civil words exchanged between the Weaver family and the Consolidated Coal Company. Finch, speaking with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being feared, informed Samuel that his petition had been noted and that his employment with the company was terminated effective immediately. Furthermore, the Weaver family had 30 days to vacate their cabin, which sat on land recently purchased by the company as part of their expansion into the upper reaches of Elkhorn Creek. The claim about land ownership was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that became truth when backed by superior firepower and corrupt officials. The coal company had perfected the art of stealing property through a combination of fraudulent paperwork, intimidated witnesses, and judges who understood which side provided their campaign contributions. Families who had owned their land for generations suddenly discovered that their deeds were invalid. Their property taxes had been miscalculated, or their boundaries had been incorrectly surveyed. Jacob, young and quick-tempered like his father, had been at that age, made the mistake of asking what compensation they would receive for improvements they had made to the property over the years. The question was reasonable, even polite, but it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. This was not a business negotiation or legal proceeding. It was a demonstration of power designed to crush resistance before it could spread. Hutchinson's response was swift and brutal, a backhand across the face that sent the 17-year-old crashing into the cabin wall, blood streaming from his nose and lips. The blow was calculated to cause maximum humiliation without permanent damage, the kind of violence that conveyed a message while leaving the victim capable of spreading that message to others. But the true horror began when Samuel moved to help his son. Crawford, who had been standing quietly in the background, drew a nickel-plated Remington revolver and pressed its barrel against Samuel's temple with the casual precision of a man who had performed this action many times before. The weapon was loaded with .44 caliber rounds that would scatter a man's brains across the cabin wall, and everyone in the room understood that Crawford would pull the trigger without hesitation if circumstances required it. "You seem to have forgotten who runs these mountains, Weaver," Crawford said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had filled the cabin. "Maybe it's time you and your boy learned some respect for your betters." What happened next would haunt Thomas Weaver for the rest of his short life, and shape his understanding of how the world actually worked beneath its veneer of civilization and law. As Samuel stood frozen, with a gun pressed to his head, and Jacob lay bleeding on the floor, the three coal police began discussing the Weaver family's fate with the detached professionalism of men planning a business transaction. Finch suggested that Samuel and Jacob should simply disappear, their bodies never found, leaving Thomas as a living reminder to other families of what happened to those who challenged company authority. Hutchinson preferred a more public example, a hanging that could be disguised as vigilante justice, with the bodies left hanging as a warning to other potential troublemakers. Crawford, as always, favored the approach that would generate the least attention from outside authorities, proposing that the men should be taken into the mountains and buried where they would never be found. Thomas, who had been sitting quietly in the corner throughout the confrontation, watched as the three men forced his father and brother outside at gunpoint. From the cabin window, he could see them being marched toward the treeing, Finch carrying a length of hemp rope that glinted with moisture in the fading light. Crawford had brought a shovel, and Hutchinson carried a canvas sack that probably contained lime to accelerate decomposition. The boy knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his family would not be returning from those dark woods. But Thomas Weaver was not the helpless child the cold police assumed him to be, and he had been preparing for this moment far longer than they realized. As the voices of the three men faded into the forest surrounding Elkhorn Creek, Thomas moved, with the quiet efficiency his grandfather had drilled into him during countless hours of training. The Spencer rifle came out of its hiding place beneath the loose floorboard near the fireplace, along with the leather cartridge pouch that contained 47 rounds of .44 caliber ammunition. Every bullet carefully maintained and inspected, each one potentially the difference between life and death. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, its walnut stock smooth from years of use, its metal components gleaming with the light coating of oil that prevented rust in the humid mountain climate. Thomas had fired this rifle thousands of times, practicing on targets ranging from tin cans at 50 yards to playing cards at twice that distance. He could load and fire 7 rounds in less than 30 seconds, and his accuracy was sufficiently remarkable that local hunters regularly consulted him about the best places to find game. But tonight, Thomas was not hunting deer or rabbits. Tonight, he was stalking the most dangerous game the mountains had to offer. Men who killed for money and pleasure, who had made the mistake of believing that a 12-year-old boy posed no threat to their plans. The darkness that had seemed like an advantage to the coal police actually favored Thomas, who had spent countless nights moving through these forests, and understood how sound carried differently depending on wind direction and atmospheric conditions. He knew every deer, trail, and rabbit run, every fallen log that might provide cover, every rocky outcropping that offered a clear field of fire while concealing the shooter's position. Most importantly, Thomas understood something about violence that his father and brother had never learned. The first rule of any fight is to ensure that your enemy doesn't realize they're in a fight until it's too late to change the outcome. The coal police expected to commit murder that night, but they assumed their only opposition would be 2 unarmed men who were already under their control. Following the voices deeper into the forest, Thomas moved parallel to their path, rather than directly behind them, using his superior knowledge of the terrain to anticipate where they were headed. The sound of their conversation indicated they were moving toward Hangman's Hollow, a small clearing beside a tributary of Elkhorn Creek, where the trees formed a natural amphitheater. It was a spot that offered privacy for their intended work, while providing easy access to running water for washing away evidence. The clearing had acquired its grisly name during the Civil War, when Confederate irregulars had used it to execute captured Union soldiers who couldn't be ransomed or exchanged. Local children were warned away from the area, not because of any supernatural threat, but because human bones still surfaced occasionally when spring floods shifted the soil. It was exactly the kind of place men like Finch, Hutchinson, and Crawford would choose for their work. Isolated, historically significant, and psychologically intimidating to their victims. Thomas reached the edge of the clearing, while the coal police were still making their way through the denser forest below. Their progress slowed by the need to control 2 prisoners and navigate unfamiliar terrain in near total darkness. He positioned himself on a rocky ledge that overlooked the clearing, a spot that provided clear lines of fire to multiple positions while offering concealment behind a screen of mountain laurel. The waiting was the hardest part. Thomas lay motionless behind his makeshift blind, the Spencer rifle resting on a natural depression in the rock that would steady his aim. While the voices of the men grew gradually closer, he could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the night breeze. Hutchinson complaining about the distance they had to walk, Crawford discussing the best depth for graves in rocky mountain soil, Finch making crude jokes about Samuel's petition and what the other miners would think when they heard about his disappearance. When the four figures finally emerged into the clearing, Thomas could see them clearly in the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy above. Samuel and Jacob were bound with rope, their hands tied behind their backs, stumbling occasionally as they were prodded forward by their captors. The coal police had clearly relaxed their vigilance, assuming that the isolation of the location made escape or rescue impossible. Marcus Finch was directing the operation with the casual authority of a man who had supervised many such executions. He ordered Hutchinson to force the prisoners to their knees beside a fallen oak tree that would serve as a convenient barrier for containing the bodies. Crawford began digging what was obviously intended to be a shallow grave, working with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed this task many times before. The first shot came without warning, the crack of the Spencer rifle echoing through the clearing like thunder as a .44 caliber bullet took Marcus Finch in the center of his chest. The impact lifted him off his feet and slammed him backwards into the creek, where his body floated face down in water that quickly turned dark with blood. Hutchinson and Crawford, caught completely off guard by an attack from an impossible direction, scrambled for cover while shouting threats and curses into the surrounding darkness. But Thomas had already moved, sliding down from his rocky perch to a new position. While the echo of his first shot was still reverberating through the forest, the Spencer's lever action allowed for rapid follow-up shots, and Thomas had practiced the sequence so many times that his hands worked without conscious thought. Extract the spent cartridge, chamber a fresh round, acquire the target, control breathing, squeeze the trigger with steady pressure. The entire cycle took less than 3 seconds, and by the time Hutchinson realized where the shots were coming from, Thomas was no longer there. The second bullet found Dale Hutchinson as he attempted to use Jacob as a human shield, the round passing through the coal policeman's skull before he could complete his threat to kill the boy. Hutchinson's massive body toppled forward, his dead weight pinning Jacob to the ground, but leaving the 17-year-old unharmed. Crawford, now alone and facing an enemy he couldn't see or understand, made the fatal mistake of panicking. Instead of taking cover and trying to locate his attacker, he abandoned the prisoners and ran toward the train in a desperate attempt to reach his horse. It was exactly the reaction Thomas had expected from a man who was accustomed to having overwhelming advantages in numbers and firepower. The final shot was the most difficult, requiring Thomas to estimate Crawford's speed and trajectory while compensating for the movement of tree branches that partially obscured his target. But his grandfather had taught him to hunt running deer in dense forest, and a fleeing human presented a much larger and more predictable target than a spooked white-tail. Crawford was 20 yards from the treeing when the third bullet caught him between the shoulder blades, the impact driving him face first into the muddy bank of the creek. His body slid down the embankment and came to rest, half submerged in the same water that was carrying away Marcus Finch's blood. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle sound of running water and the labored breathing of Samuel and Jacob Weaver, who found themselves staring at 3 corpses while trying to comprehend how their youngest family member had just saved their lives. Thomas emerged from the forest like a ghost, the Spencer rifle held casually in his small hands, his expression as calm as if he had just returned from hunting rabbits. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling to cut his father's bonds with a hunting knife that appeared from somewhere in his clothing. His voice was steady, almost conversational, showing no trace of the excitement or horror that should have followed such violence. Samuel, his hands shaking as circulation returned, could only stare at his youngest son while struggling to process what had just occurred. The boy had moved through the forest in complete darkness, positioned himself for optimal shots, and eliminated 3 armed men with a precision that would have impressed professional soldiers. Most disturbing of all, Thomas showed no signs of emotional distress or moral conflict about what he had done. "They were going to kill you," Thomas said, matter-of-factly, as he freed Jacob from his bonds. "I couldn't let that happen." The simplicity of his reasoning was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire incident. Thomas had not acted from rage or fear, but from a calculated assessment of the situation and a practical solution to the problem it presented. He had killed 3 men with no more emotional involvement than he would have shown while shooting the rabbits that supplemented the family's dinner table. But the true horror of that night was yet to be revealed. Because what Samuel and Jacob didn't understand was that Thomas had been planning for this moment for months. The position he had chosen for his ambush, the route he had taken through the forest, even the timing of his shots. Everything had been carefully rehearsed during countless hours of solitary practice. Thomas had known that the coal company would eventually come for his family, and he had prepared accordingly. The only surprise was that they had waited so long. The plan Samuel devised in those desperate hours beside Elkhorn Creek was both brilliant and heartbreaking in its simplicity. But it was Thomas who provided the crucial details that would make the deception believable. As the 3 men stood beside the bodies of their would-be killers, the boy outlined a strategy that demonstrated a frightening understanding of human psychology and institutional corruption. The 3 dead coal police would be buried where they had fallen, their disappearance attributed to the dangerous nature of their work and the hostile territory they patrolled. Samuel and Jacob would stage their own deaths, leaving behind evidence that would convince investigators they had been killed in retaliation for the security men's disappearance. Thomas, armed with a story carefully crafted by his father, but refined by his own understanding of how adults thought, would be the sole survivor of a tragedy that never actually occurred. But the plan required sacrifices that would haunt the surviving weavers for the rest of their lives. Samuel and Jacob would have to abandon not just their home and possessions, but their very identities, traveling hundreds of miles to start new lives under assumed names among relatives who had agreed to shelter them without asking too many questions. They would never be able to return to West Virginia, never be able to contact Thomas directly, never even be able to know how their sacrifice had affected the boy's development. Thomas, meanwhile, would remain behind to face a world that had already demonstrated its willingness to destroy him, armed with nothing but his intelligence, his rifle, and a growing understanding that survival sometimes required becoming more dangerous than the forces that threatened you. He would be alone in a way that no child should ever have to experience, carrying secrets that would isolate him from every human relationship he would ever attempt to form. The burial of the 3 coal police took most of the night with Samuel and Jacob working by moonlight to dig graves that would be deep enough to prevent discovery, but shallow enough to complete before dawn. Thomas served as lookout, his keen hearing alert for any sounds that might indicate approaching riders or searchers. The boy also provided practical advice about soil composition and drainage that revealed an unsettling familiarity with the mechanics of concealing bodies. The graves were positioned beneath the spreading roots of an ancient oak tree, where the disturbed earth would be less noticeable, and the roots would eventually grow through the remains to make exhumation nearly impossible. Thomas suggested scattering leaf mold and forest debris over the burial sites, then marking them with subtle blazes on nearby trees that would be invisible to casual observers, but would allow him to locate the graves if necessary. As dawn approached, the 3 weavers gathered their few possessions and prepared to implement a deception that would protect Samuel and Jacob, while transforming Thomas into something number 12-year-old should ever become. Samuel took his son aside for a final conversation that would have to serve as both farewell and instruction for the years of loneliness that lay ahead. "Remember that we love you," Samuel said, his voice breaking despite his efforts to remain strong. "Remember that what we are doing is necessary not just to save our lives, but to protect other families from what happened to us. And remember that someday when you're old enough and strong enough, you'll have the power to make sure this kind of thing never happens again." Thomas nodded with the solemn gravity of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly, but his dark eyes revealed an understanding that went far beyond his years. He had already begun to formulate plans that his father couldn't imagine, schemes that would extend far beyond simple survival, to encompass a systematic campaign of retribution against everyone who had contributed to his family's destruction. The staged crime scene that Thomas and his father created in the cabin was a masterpiece of misdirection that would fool even experienced investigators. Furniture was overturned to suggest a struggle. Blood from a cut on Jacob's hand was scattered in patterns that indicated violence, and several of Samuel's possessions were removed to suggest that the attackers had taken trophies. Most importantly, Thomas planted evidence that would point investigators toward the conclusion that his father and brother had been taken alive, presumably for questioning or public execution. By the time hunters found Thomas 3 days later, walking along a mountain trail with his grandfather's rifle and blood on his clothes, the boy had transformed himself into the perfect victim, traumatized but coherent, helpful but not suspiciously, knowledgeable, sympathetic, but not so damaged as to require extensive care that might reveal inconsistencies in his story. The blood on his clothes, he explained to Sheriff William Thornton, came from trying to help his wounded father before the company men dragged him away. The tears in his garments were from running through dense forest in the dark, fleeing men who had promised to hunt him down if he tried to interfere. His apparent calm was the shock that often followed traumatic experiences, a reasonable explanation that no one thought to question too closely, especially when dealing with a child who had clearly suffered terrible losses. Sheriff Thornton was a man who had survived the chaos of Reconstruction by learning when not to ask too many questions, when to accept explanations that satisfied legal requirements without delving too deeply into uncomfortable truths. At 53, he had seen enough violence and corruption to understand that sometimes the best solution was the one that prevented additional bloodshed, even if it meant compromising his own principles. The discovery of the 3 bodies changed everything, transforming what had appeared to be a simple case of corporate intimidation into something far more complex and dangerous. When Thornton's search party found the corpses buried in shallow graves near Elkhorn Creek, the sheriff realized he was dealing with a situation that could destroy not just his own career, but the entire economic foundation of the county. The men had been shot with precision that suggested military training or exceptional skill with firearms. Yet, the only suspect was a child who should have been fleeing in terror, not engaging in armed combat with experienced killers. The positioning of the bodies indicated they had been shot by someone with an elevated vantage point, but the terrain around the burial site offered limited options for such a position. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in selective blindness and willful ignorance. Sheriff Thornton, facing pressure from both the mining company and his own conscience, chose to pursue a version of events that satisfied legal requirements while avoiding the more disturbing implications of what had actually occurred. The official report stated that Marcus Finch, Dale Hutchinson, and James Crawford had been killed during an altercation with Samuel and Jacob Weaver, who had subsequently fled the area. Thomas Weaver, found traumatized and alone, was the sole surviving witness to what was described as a dispute over mining operations that escalated to violence. But several details troubled those who knew the truth. The precision of the gunshot suggested a single shooter with remarkable accuracy, not the desperate gun battle described in the official report. Most disturbing of all was Thomas himself. Rather than displaying the grief and confusion expected of a child who had lost his entire family, the boy exhibited an almost supernatural composure that unnerved everyone who encountered him. When asked about the details of that night, Thomas would fix the questioner with steady dark eyes and provide answers that were technically truthful while revealing nothing of substance. The company men came for Papa and Jacob, he would say. There was shooting. I ran into the woods and hid until morning. The Consolidated Coal Company, faced with the loss of 3 key enforcers and a story that painted their security operations in an unfavorable light, made a decision that would prove to be their second fatal mistake. Rather than investigating the incident thoroughly, they chose to quietly bury the matter while implementing new policies designed to prevent similar incidents. Company executives reasoned that the death of 3 coal police, while regrettable, was preferable to a prolonged investigation that might reveal the extent of their intimidation tactics. What they failed to understand was that Thomas Weaver had not acted out of desperation or fear, but from a calculated understanding that some problems could only be solved through violence. The company's decision to retreat rather than retaliate was interpreted by the boy not as wisdom, but as weakness, a perception that would have deadly consequences in the months that followed. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in these West Virginia mountains intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the tale of Thomas Weaver. Winter arrived early in the mountains that year, bringing with it a series of accidents that began to reshape the balance of power throughout the coal mining region. Company supervisors who had been particularly brutal toward workers suffered mysterious falls down mine shafts. Store managers who had gouged families with inflated prices were found dead in their homes, victims of what appeared to be botched robberies that left money untouched but removed lives with surgical precision. The truth about Thomas Weaver began to emerge in February 1876, when Sheriff Thornton received an urgent message that would change his understanding of everything that had happened since that September night by Elkhorn Creek. The message came from Dr. Marcus Henley, the company physician who treated injured miners, and it contained information that made Thornton's blood run cold. 3 more company employees had died in the past month, each death occurring under circumstances that initially appeared accidental, but revealed disturbing patterns when examined closely. Mine supervisor Garrett Mills had fallen down a shaft during a routine inspection, but witnesses reported that he had been standing well away from the edge when he suddenly pitched forward, as if struck by an invisible force. Store manager Vernon Polk had been found dead in his locked office, apparently the victim of a heart attack, but the coroner had discovered a small puncture wound behind his left ear that suggested a thin blade inserted with surgical precision. Most troubling of all was the death of Augustus Blackwood, the mine foreman who had torn up Samuel Weaver's petition. Blackwood had been discovered in his home, seated at his kitchen table, with a cup of coffee growing cold before him, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. There were no signs of violence, no indication of how an intruder might have entered or escaped. Yet, Blackwood was undeniably dead, killed by what the doctor could only describe as catastrophic shock to the nervous system. Dr. Henley's message included a detail that convinced Thornton immediate action was necessary. Each victim had been found with a small piece of paper in their pocket, apparently placed there after death. The papers contained a single word written in a child's careful script: justice. That afternoon, Thornton rode alone into the mountains, following a trail that led to a secluded valley several miles from town, where local hunters reported seeing smoke from a small fire. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life and force him to confront the true extent of what Thomas Weaver had become. The boy had constructed what could only be described as a training camp, complete with elaborate target ranges, obstacle courses, and detailed maps of every company facility in the region. Wooden figures positioned at various distances and elevations represented different tactical challenges, each one designed to simulate the specific circumstances under which company employees might be vulnerable to attack. But these were not the crude targets a child might make for innocent play. They were anatomically correct representations of human beings carved with disturbing attention to detail and marked with precise notations about vital organs, arterial pathways, and optimal angles for inflicting fatal wounds. Some targets were positioned to simulate moving prey mounted on rope and pulley systems that allowed them to swing or rotate unpredictably. Most chilling of all was a detailed journal Thomas had kept documenting his observations of company employees, daily routines, their habits and weaknesses, their fears and vulnerabilities. The journal contained floor plans of their homes, schedules of their movements, and psychological profiles that demonstrated an understanding of human nature that should have been impossible for someone his age. When Thomas emerged from behind a screen of mountain laurel carrying his grandfather's Spencer rifle with the casual familiarity of a professional soldier, Sheriff Thornton found himself face to face with something that defied easy categorization. The boy still looked like a child, small for his 13 years with dark hair and serious eyes, but his demeanor suggested someone who had traveled far beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. "I've been expecting you, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice carrying none of the difference that adults typically expected from children. "Dr. Henley was bound to notice the patterns eventually. He's more observant than most company employees." The conversation that followed revealed the true scope of Thomas's campaign against the coal company and the methodical precision with which he had planned and executed his revenge. He described each killing with the detached professionalism of a military officer briefing his superiors, explaining the tactical considerations that had influenced his choice of methods and timing. Garrett Mills had been eliminated because his brutal treatment of miners had resulted in the deaths of at least 6 men whose safety complaints had been ignored. Vernon Polk had charged prices at the company store that had literally starved children, using his position to extort sexual favors from desperate wives whose husbands couldn't afford basic necessities. Augustus Blackwood had been responsible for the cabin that killed Thomas's cousin 2 years earlier, deliberately ignoring structural problems because repairs would have interfered with production quotas. Each man received exactly what he deserved, Thomas explained with frightening calm. Mills fell to his death, just like the miners whose safety he ignored. Polk died slowly and painfully, the way children starve when their families can't afford food. Blackwood died of fear, the same fear he used to control workers who dared to question his decisions. When Sheriff Thornton asked how a 13-year-old boy had acquired the knowledge and skills necessary to commit such sophisticated murders, Thomas's response revealed the true horror of what the coal company's violence had created. His grandfather, Ezekiel, had not merely taught him to hunt and shoot, but had passed down the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of mountain men who had survived by being more dangerous than the dangers that surrounded them. The old man had fought in 2 wars, lived through the worst violence of the frontier period, and understood that sometimes civilization's rules were inadequate protection against civilization's failures. He had trained Thomas not just as a hunter, but as a weapon that could be deployed when normal methods of justice proved insufficient. Grandfather always said that sheep produce wolves when they forget how to be sheepdogs, Thomas continued, his dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that no child should possess. The coal company forgot that mountain people have been killing their enemies for a lot longer than corporations have existed. The most chilling moment came when Sheriff Thornton asked directly whether Thomas felt any remorse for the lives he had taken. The boy considered the question with the seriousness of someone being asked about a matter of profound philosophical importance, then delivered an answer that would echo in Thornton's nightmares for decades to come. "Sheriff, do you feel remorse when you put down a rabid dog?" Thomas asked. "These men were diseases that infected everything they touched. They destroyed families, killed children through neglect and greed, turned honest work into a form of slavery. I didn't murder them. I performed surgery on a sick community. The only tragedy is that it took so long for someone to do what needed to be done." The final confrontation between Thomas Weaver and the forces that had shaped his young life came, not through violence, but through a negotiation that would haunt Sheriff Thornton for decades. As they sat beside Elkhorn Creek, where 3 bodies had once been buried. Thornton found himself bargaining with a child who spoke with the cold precision of a military strategist. Thomas had no intention of simply disappearing. His demands were specific and non-negotiable. Compensation for families of miners killed in preventable accidents, immediate installation of safety equipment, and an end to the coal police's reign of terror. Most chilling of all, he wanted written guarantees, documents that would hold the company accountable for their promises. "You think this ends with me leaving?" Thomas said, his 13-year-old voice carrying an authority that made Thornton's skin crawl. "But I've already taught them something they'll never forget: fear. They used to sleep soundly, knowing they had guns and money. Now they understand that mountains produce predators they never imagined." The negotiation took 3 days. Company executives, terrified of losing more personnel to an enemy they couldn't see or catch, agreed to terms that would have seemed impossible months earlier. But Thomas wasn't satisfied with promises. He demanded proof of compliance, regular reports, and most disturbing of all, he established a network of miners' children who would serve as his eyes and ears throughout the region. The transformation that followed Thomas's departure was immediate and profound. Within weeks, safety equipment that had been unavailable for years suddenly appeared in the mines. Company store prices dropped overnight. The most brutal supervisors were quietly reassigned to distant locations, and the coal police simply vanished. Their boarding house at Devil's Rest abandoned so quickly that meals were left rotting on tables. But Sheriff Thornton discovered that Thomas's influence extended far beyond simple intimidation. The boy had spent months documenting every safety violation, every instance of corporate abuse, every family driven to starvation by company policies. Before leaving West Virginia, he had compiled this information into detailed reports that found their way to newspapers in Charleston, Baltimore, and Washington. Reports that sparked investigations the coal company couldn't buy their way out of. The letters that Thornton received from Ohio revealed Thomas' gradual transformation from killer to businessman, but they also contained details that made the sheriff question whether the boy had ever truly escaped the darkness that had consumed him. Thomas wrote about his education, his growing success in Cincinnati's business community, but always with an undercurrent of calculation that suggested he was still planning, still preparing for future battles. By 1885, Thomas had become exactly what his grandfather had trained him to be, a weapon disguised as a pillar of the community. His business empire included strategic investments in mining equipment companies, railroad lines that served coal operations, and even banks that financed mining ventures. He wielded economic influence like other men used guns, applying pressure with surgical precision to protect workers' interests across 3 states. The miners of West Virginia never learned Thomas's true identity, but they felt his protection for decades. Labor organizers found themselves with unexpected funding. Safety advocates discovered that company executives were remarkably willing to negotiate. Children of mining families received scholarships to distant schools, opportunities that broke the cycle of corporate servitude that had trapped their parents. When Thomas died in 1924, his funeral in Cincinnati was attended by hundreds of people who knew him only as a generous philanthropist. But that same week, miners throughout Appalachia reported strange incidents. Supervisors who had been planning to cut safety measures suddenly reversed their decisions. Company executives who had been resisting union negotiations abruptly became cooperative, and several particularly brutal mine guards simply disappeared without explanation. The 3 graves beside Elkhorn Creek were discovered during a flood in 1915, but by then the bones were identified only as unknown casualties of labor violence. What the investigators never found was a 4th grave hidden deeper in the forest containing the remains of Henry Caldwell, the informant who had betrayed Samuel Weaver's petition. Thomas had saved him for last, visiting him on a cold February night in 1876. Just days before leaving for Ohio. Sheriff Thornton took the secret of that final killing to his own grave, but his journals discovered after his death in 1899 contained a single haunting entry. The boy understood something the rest of us never learned, that evil creates its own nemesis, and sometimes that nemesis wears the face of a child who learned too early that mercy is a luxury the innocent cannot afford. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying transformations happen not in moments of supernatural horror, but in the slow corruption of innocence by systematic cruelty. Thomas Weaver was not born a killer. He was carefully crafted into one by men who never imagined their victims might learn to hunt them in return. What do you think of this story? Could a child really orchestrate such calculated revenge? Or does this tale reveal something darker about what society creates when it abandons its most vulnerable members? Leave your comment below with your theories about what really happened in those West Virginia mountains. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.